Nothing screams louder than silence when impossible evidence appears. Every impossible clue reshapes belief. Every forgotten trace whispers impossible intentions. Fear grows where logic collapses, inviting unseen patterns into ordinary thought. 15 chilling enigmas wait ahead, each threatening comfortable assumptions while pulling curiosity toward an unforgettable abyss that refuses escape. The winds that cross the hills of northwestern Iran carry little trace of the violence that once transformed Hasanlu into one of archaeology's most haunting time capsules. Rising above the surrounding plains, the ancient fortress stood on a strategic mound overlooking fertile valleys and distant mountain routes. From its walls, generations of inhabitants watched merchants, travelers, and armies move across landscapes that connected Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Iranian plateau. Today, only weathered ruins remain, yet every stone seems to preserve the memory of a single catastrophic day more than 3,000 years ago. Hasanlu flourished during the early 1st millennium BC, growing into a prosperous fortified settlement with imposing mud brick architecture, workshops, temples, and large storage facilities. Excavations conducted during the 20th century revealed evidence of an organized community whose wealth depended upon agriculture, trade, and skilled craftsmanship. Among the discoveries was the famous Golden Bowl of Hasanlu, an exquisitely decorated vessel whose imagery continues to inspire debate among historians seeking to understand its religious and cultural significance. Yet it was not gold that made Hasanlu unforgettable. It was a meal that never ended. Deep inside one of the fortress buildings, archaeologists uncovered an extraordinary scene frozen in time. Human skeletons lay exactly where they had fallen during the city's destruction. Unlike many ancient sites where centuries of occupation disturbed earlier remains, Hasanlu preserved individuals almost exactly as they had died. Walls had collapsed suddenly, sealing rooms beneath thick layers of debris before looters or scavengers could reach them. Among these discoveries was a room containing food, drinking vessels, and the remains of what appeared to be an interrupted gathering. Bowls still rested near their occupants. Storage jars remained in place. Everyday objects lay untouched, as though their owners expected to return within moments. They never did. Radiocarbon dating and archaeological evidence suggest that Hasanlu was violently destroyed around the late 9th century BC. Fire swept through the fortress with astonishing intensity. Roofs collapsed. Mud brick walls hardened from the extreme heat before burying hundreds of victims beneath the ruins. Rather than abandoning the city gradually, its inhabitants seem to have been overwhelmed almost instantly. Who attacked Hasanlu remains uncertain. Several neighboring powers occupied this politically unstable region. Expanding kingdoms competed for trade routes, agricultural land, and strategic fortresses. Some scholars have proposed that the attackers may have belonged to the kingdom of Urartu, whose influence expanded across eastern Anatolia during this period. Others suggest rival regional states or local conflicts whose details disappeared from surviving written records. Without definitive inscriptions describing the assault, the identity of the attackers remains an unresolved chapter of ancient history. The final feast has become one of Hasanlu's most enduring mysteries because it raises difficult questions about the final moments before destruction. Were these people celebrating, holding a religious ceremony, sharing an ordinary evening meal, or had they gathered inside the building seeking refuge while chaos unfolded outside? The archaeological evidence allows several interpretations. Food storage vessels indicate that provisions were available. The arrangement of bowls suggests people had been eating or preparing to eat. Some individuals appear to have been moving quickly through the structure when collapsing walls trapped them forever. Others seem almost motionless, as though they never realized the danger approaching. One remarkable aspect of Hasanlu is how vividly it captures the suddenness of catastrophe. Unlike Pompeii, where volcanic ash buried a Roman city centuries later, Hasanlu preserves the consequences of warfare. Every fallen doorway, shattered staircase, and crushed skeleton illustrates the terrifying speed with which an entire community disappeared. Some researchers believe the interrupted meal reflects nothing more mysterious than ordinary daily life interrupted by an unexpected military assault. According to this interpretation, the simplicity of the scene is precisely what makes it so powerful. Families do not expect history to arrive while sharing food. The most ordinary moments often become the last. Others wonder whether the gathering held deeper significance. Certain buildings within Hasanlu appear to have served ceremonial or administrative purposes. If the meal occurred inside an important public structure, perhaps those present included officials, priests, or military leaders making urgent decisions as enemies approached. Could the feast have been connected to ritual offerings intended to seek divine protection during a siege? Ancient Near Eastern societies frequently combined political authority with religious ceremony, making such possibilities difficult to dismiss completely. More speculative theories move even further beyond conventional archaeology. Some writers have suggested that the unusual preservation reflects secret rituals interrupted by invasion or forgotten religious traditions no surviving texts describe. Others point to the absence of detailed written records from Hasanlu itself, arguing that the fortress may have belonged to a culture whose beliefs have almost entirely disappeared. Without inscriptions explaining what occurred inside those final rooms, imagination naturally fills the silence left behind. Still, the physical evidence offers both clarity and restraint. The collapsed architecture, burned debris, weapons, and human remains all testify to a violent destruction rooted firmly in historical reality. Yet, archaeology excels at revealing what happened, not always why people made the choices they did in their final hours. Why did some remain inside while others attempted escape? Why were valuable objects left behind? And what conversations echoed through those rooms just before smoke, fire, and collapsing walls brought centuries of life within Hasanlu's fortress to an abrupt end? Yet while Hasanlu preserves the final moments of a city consumed by fire, other civilizations leave behind a different kind of silence. Not one sealed beneath collapsed walls, but one scattered across distant coastlines and carried away by the sea. Sometimes, the greatest mysteries are not found where people died, but where entire kingdoms seem to dissolve into history, leaving only fragments for future generations to assemble. Far out in the eastern Mediterranean, the island of Cyprus rises from blue waters that have connected continents for thousands of years. Rocky mountains dominate its interior, while sheltered harbors open toward Egypt, Anatolia, the Levant, and the Aegean. For ancient sailors, the island was impossible to ignore. Rich deposits of copper made Cyprus one of the most valuable places in the Bronze Age world, drawing merchants, diplomats, and kings from every direction. But in ancient records, Cyprus often appears under another name: Alashiya. For centuries, this mysterious kingdom occupied a central place in international politics. Its rulers exchanged gifts with pharaohs, negotiated with powerful empires, dispatched enormous shipments of copper across the Mediterranean, and maintained diplomatic relationships with some of the greatest civilizations of the late Bronze Age. Yet, despite its importance, one question has lingered for generations. Who were the last rulers of Alashiya? The answer remains surprisingly elusive. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, Alashiya has left behind relatively few written records of its own. Much of what historians know comes from correspondence discovered elsewhere, particularly the famous Amarna letters, clay tablets recording diplomatic exchanges between rulers across the ancient Near East during the 14th century BC. Within these letters, the king of Alashiya speaks confidently as an equal to Egypt's pharaoh. He sends copper by the hundreds of talents. He apologizes when disease limits production. He discusses trade, diplomacy, piracy, and international affairs with remarkable familiarity. Yet, he never clearly identifies his kingdom's precise political structure or dynasty. His voice survives. His identity does not. For many years, scholars debated whether Alashiya referred to Cyprus at all. Some proposed locations along the coast of Syria or Anatolia. Others suggested different islands scattered across the eastern Mediterranean. Only through decades of archaeological discoveries, combined with scientific analysis of clay tablets themselves, did the balance of evidence gradually point toward Cyprus. Chemical examination of the clay used for diplomatic correspondence revealed mineral signatures remarkably consistent with Cypriot geology. The kingdom of Alashiya had likely stood here all along. Even so, locating its capital has proven far more difficult. Several archaeological sites have been proposed. Enkomi, situated near the island's eastern coast, remains one of the strongest candidates. Excavations there uncovered evidence of extensive trade, impressive architecture, imported luxury goods, workshops, temples, and fortifications befitting an important administrative center. Other scholars favor sites such as Kalavasos or Alassa, each offering compelling pieces of the puzzle while leaving important questions unanswered. Could Alashiya have shifted its political center over time? Might multiple cities have shared administrative authority? Or are archaeologists still searching for a capital hidden beneath untouched ground? No single discovery has settled the debate. The mystery deepens during the closing years of the Bronze Age. Around the 12th century BC, the eastern Mediterranean entered a period of extraordinary upheaval. Great kingdoms that had dominated the region for centuries began collapsing with astonishing speed. Trade networks fractured, palaces burned, written records became increasingly scarce. Populations moved across land and sea in patterns historians continue to debate today. Alashiya stood directly within this storm. Letters sent from its rulers describe growing insecurity. One particularly famous correspondence mentions attacks by sea raiders. The king of Alashiya insists that his own people are innocent of piracy, while warning that hostile forces threaten coastal settlements. His concern feels immediate. His uncertainty feels unmistakably human. Soon afterward, the historical trail begins to fade. Archaeological excavations across Cyprus reveal widespread destruction at numerous late Bronze Age settlements. Fires consumed major urban centers. Rebuilding occurred in some places but not others. Imported goods became less common. International trade, once the foundation of Alashiya's prosperity, contracted dramatically. What became of the kingdom's royal family? No definitive royal tomb has been identified. No clear succession lists survive. No triumphant inscription records a final battle or peaceful transition. Instead, the rulers simply disappear from history. Mainstream historians generally interpret these events as part of the broader Bronze Age collapse. Rather than a single catastrophe, they envision overlapping crises. Warfare, political instability, earthquakes, economic disruption, drought, changing trade routes, and large-scale migrations. Under this view, Alashiya's monarchy likely fragmented gradually as centralized authority weakened throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Yet, the evidence refuses to tell a straightforward story. Some settlements show signs of violent destruction. Others appear to have been abandoned more peacefully. Still, others continued functioning, though on a reduced scale. The collapse was uneven, complex, difficult to compress into one explanation. This uncertainty has encouraged more speculative interpretations. Some researchers wonder whether Alashiya's rulers deliberately relocated inland, abandoning vulnerable coastal capitals while attempting to preserve political authority elsewhere on the island. If so, traces of their final court may remain buried beneath later settlements, waiting for excavation. Others have suggested that the royal dynasty survived under another name, merging with emerging political groups during the early Iron Age. Ancient kingdoms frequently reinvented themselves after periods of crisis, adopting new identities while preserving older traditions beneath the surface. Could Alashiya have continued in forms historians simply fail to recognize? Then, there are theories reaching even further beyond conventional scholarship. Because Cyprus occupied such an important position between major civilizations, some writers have imagined secret alliances, hidden royal refuges, or maritime networks capable of surviving long after official kingdoms collapsed. Others connect Alashiya to enduring legends of lost seafaring powers whose influence stretched far beyond surviving historical records. These ideas remain speculative, supported more by possibility than evidence, yet they illustrate how powerfully Alashiya captures the imagination. A kingdom that once exchanged diplomatic letters with the greatest rulers of its age should not simply vanish. And yet, it seems to have done exactly that. Adding another layer to the mystery is the remarkable sophistication of Cypriot metallurgy. Copper from the island fueled economies across the Mediterranean for centuries. Mines, furnaces, workshops, and trading ports operated on an enormous scale. Such an industry required organization, administration, labor, and protection. Who coordinated this vast enterprise during Alashiya's final years? Who controlled the shipments crossing hundreds of miles of open sea? Who signed the final agreements before international commerce unraveled? Those individuals certainly existed. Their names have largely been lost. Even the diplomatic language preserved within surviving tablets hints at relationships more complex than simple trade. Kings addressed one another as brothers, exchanged luxurious gifts, discussed marriages, requested assistance, and occasionally voiced suspicion. Behind every surviving letter stood negotiations, rivalries, ambitions, and personal decisions that shaped the destiny of kingdoms. Yet the rulers themselves remain shadows. Perhaps the greatest irony surrounding Alashiya is that its products survived far better than its dynasty. Copper ingots stamped in distinctive oxide shapes have been discovered throughout the Mediterranean, silent witnesses to an international economy that once connected distant shores. Ships carried the island's wealth to ports hundreds of miles away, while the identities of those who governed its production gradually disappeared beneath centuries of changing civilizations. Standing today among the ruins of ancient Cypriot cities, surrounded by collapsed walls, weathered stone foundations, and fragments of pottery warmed by Mediterranean sunlight, it becomes surprisingly easy to imagine sails appearing along the horizon. Merchant vessels once crowded these waters. Royal envoys once carried sealed messages between kings. Somewhere within those journeys lived the final rulers of Alashiya, leaders who witnessed the end of one of the Bronze Age's greatest maritime kingdoms. Whether they fell with their cities, escaped into obscurity, or transformed into something history has yet to recognize remains one of the Mediterranean's quietest and most enduring mysteries, leaving us to wonder whether the next excavation might finally uncover the names that the sea has guarded for more than 3,000 years.
And as the fate of Alashiya fades into the Mediterranean horizon, another kingdom emerges from the heart of Anatolia, leaving behind an equally perplexing trail. Here, the sea gives way to vast highlands, rugged mountain passes, and windswept plains where mighty empires once struggled for control. In this landscape, entire capitals could rise to prominence and then seemingly disappear from history without a clear trace. Across the broad plateau of central Anatolia, rolling hills stretch toward distant mountains beneath enormous skies. Rivers carve quiet valleys through fields that have sustained communities for thousands of years. At first glance, the landscape appears timeless, almost empty, yet hidden beneath these plains may lie one of the greatest missing capitals of the Bronze Age, a royal city that once stood at the center of imperial politics before slipping almost entirely from human memory. Its name was Tarhuntassa. Unlike mythical cities that survive only in legend, Tarhuntassa appears repeatedly in historical records. Hittite kings wrote about it, royal treaties referred to it, diplomatic documents acknowledged its political importance. At one point, it may even have served as the capital of the Hittite Empire itself. And yet, despite decades of archaeological research, no one can say with certainty where the city actually stood. It is a mystery unlike almost any other. Most ancient capitals leave unmistakable footprints. Massive walls, monumental gates, royal palaces, temples, archives, and cemeteries usually remain even after centuries of abandonment. Cities such as Hattusa, Nineveh, and Babylon still dominate their landscapes through sheer archaeological scale. Tarhuntassa does not. Instead, historians possess something almost more frustrating, a capital described by its contemporaries without a universally accepted location. The story begins during one of the Hittite Empire's most challenging periods. During the 13th century BC, political instability, external threats, and shifting military priorities placed enormous pressure upon the empire. King Muwatalli II made an extraordinary decision that has puzzled historians ever since. He moved the royal court, rather than governing from Hattusa, the traditional Hittite capital, far to the north. He transferred the center of imperial administration southward to Tarhuntassa. The reasons remain debated. Some scholars argue the move was primarily military. Southern frontiers demanded closer supervision as conflicts intensified with neighboring powers. Relocating the capital would allow faster communication and greater control over strategically important territories. Others believe religious considerations also played a role. Certain deities worshipped in southern Anatolia may have held special significance for Muwatalli. Ancient kings rarely separated politics from religion. A capital was not merely an administrative center. It was a sacred landscape where divine authority and royal legitimacy became inseparable. Could Tarhuntassa have represented both a political and spiritual transformation? Perhaps. Yet even after the royal court eventually returned North, Tarhuntassa remained remarkably influential. Later treaties identify its rulers almost as equals within the imperial system. Members of the royal family governed the region with considerable autonomy. Inscriptions suggest the kingdom retained prestige long after its brief period as the empire's capital. This raises an obvious question: how could such an important city simply disappear? For generations, archaeologists searched across southern Anatolia for answers. Numerous sites have been proposed. Among the strongest candidates is the region surrounding modern Konya, where extensive plains match several geographical clues preserved within Hittite texts. Others point toward locations farther south, arguing that descriptions of rivers, mountains, and neighboring territories better fit different landscapes. Each proposal solves certain problems, each creates new ones. No excavation has uncovered the unmistakable combination of royal archives, monumental architecture, and inscriptions expected from a former imperial capital. The absence becomes increasingly difficult to explain. One possibility is surprisingly simple. Perhaps Tarhuntassa still lies hidden beneath an unexcavated mound. Anatolia contains thousands of archaeological tells, many never systematically explored. Entire Bronze Age cities remain buried beneath farmland villages and accumulated layers of history. If Tarhuntassa survives beneath one of these sites, only a fraction may currently be visible. Another explanation suggests that archaeologists have already found the city, but failed to recognize it. Ancient settlements often changed names across centuries. Political transitions, linguistic evolution, and shifting populations could transform how places were remembered. If later civilizations referred to Tarhuntassa by another name, connecting those identities may prove extraordinarily difficult without decisive inscriptions. The written evidence itself introduces additional mysteries. One of the most intriguing discoveries associated with Tarhuntassa comes from the famous bronze tablet uncovered at Hattusa in 1986. This remarkable document records a treaty between the Hittite king Tudhaliya IV and his cousin Karunta, ruler of Tarhuntassa. The treaty reveals a relationship balancing cooperation with tension. Karunta enjoyed exceptional authority, his kingdom possessed recognized borders, his rights received formal guarantees. Yet beneath the diplomatic language, many historians detect unease. Why would such extensive legal protections become necessary unless political rivalry already existed? Some scholars suspect Tarhuntassa evolved into a competing center of royal legitimacy. Members of the Hittite dynasty governed both kingdoms. Each possessed powerful regional support. Each could potentially claim authority over the wider empire. Did quiet competition exist beneath outward loyalty? The surviving records never answer directly. Adding further complexity, seals bearing the name of Karunta have been discovered at Hattusa itself. Some researchers interpret this as evidence that Karunta briefly gained control over the imperial capital during a period of political turmoil. If true, Tarhuntassa may have stood at the center of an internal struggle that unfolded during the empire's final decades. Others urge caution. Royal seals alone cannot reconstruct entire political revolutions. Administrative exchanges, diplomatic visits, or ceremonial functions might equally explain their presence. The evidence remains tantalizing, yet incomplete. Then came the Bronze Age collapse. Around the early 12th century BC, the Hittite Empire fragmented with astonishing speed. Cities were abandoned, trade networks disintegrated. Royal authority disappeared across much of Anatolia. Hattusa itself fell into ruin. Tarhuntassa also vanished from the historical record. No surviving chronicle describes its destruction. No inscription records its surrender. No foreign king boasts of conquering it. It simply ceases to exist as a recognizable political entity. Mainstream archaeology generally interprets this disappearance within the wider collapse affecting much of the eastern Mediterranean. Environmental pressures, migration, warfare, internal instability, and economic decline likely combined in ways too complex for any single explanation. Yet Tarhuntassa leaves behind questions unlike those surrounding many other lost cities. If it truly served as an imperial capital, where are its archives? Where are its monumental temples? Where are the royal tombs expected from generations of influential rulers? The silence seems disproportionate. Naturally, alternative theories have emerged.
And if Tarhuntassa reminds us that entire capitals can disappear while their names survive, Sanauli presents the opposite mystery. Here, the landscape preserved the people, but concealed the meaning of their final moments. Instead of searching for a missing city, archaeologists found silent graves whose unusual arrangements continue to challenge long-held assumptions about ritual, power, and death in Bronze Age India. The fertile plains of the upper Ganges basin appear peaceful today. Fields stretch toward the horizon, broken only by scattered villages, narrow roads, and clusters of trees swaying in the seasonal winds. For thousands of years, these rich lands have supported farming communities, each generation building upon the traces of those who came before. Beneath the soil, however, another landscape remained hidden, one belonging to an age when emerging societies experimented with new forms of authority, technology, and belief. In 2018, excavations near the modern village of Sanauli in Uttar Pradesh revealed one of the most remarkable Bronze Age burial sites Alashiya ever discovered on the Indian subcontinent. The graves contained elaborate coffins decorated with copper, finely crafted weapons, ceremonial objects, helmets, shields, and, perhaps most striking of all, vehicles often described as chariots or ceremonial carts. The discoveries immediately attracted international attention. Yet, amid the excitement surrounding these extraordinary burials, another question quietly emerged. Were some of the individuals buried at Sanauli victims of ritual sacrifice? The possibility remains controversial, and the evidence continues to invite careful examination. The cemetery itself dates to roughly the late 3rd or early 2nd millennium BC, although exact dating remains the subject of ongoing research. Dozens of graves have been uncovered, revealing a society capable of producing sophisticated metalwork and conducting carefully planned funerary ceremonies. Many burials followed consistent patterns. Bodies were placed with pottery, ornaments, copper objects, and offerings that appear intended to accompany the deceased into whatever existence they believed followed death. These were not hurried burials. They reflected ceremony, preparation, intention. Among the most elaborate graves were those containing the copper-covered vehicles. Whether these were true horse-drawn chariots, ox-drawn ceremonial carts, or symbols of elite authority continues to be debated by specialists. Regardless of their exact function, they demonstrate exceptional craftsmanship and suggest that at least some individuals occupied positions of considerable prestige. Power, however, often carried profound religious meaning in ancient societies, and where royal authority existed, ritual sometimes accompanied death in unexpected ways. The discussion surrounding possible human sacrifice largely centers on the unusual relationships between certain burials and the individuals placed beside them. In several ancient civilizations across the world, elite graves occasionally included attendants, servants, family members, or retainers believed to have accompanied powerful leaders into the afterlife. Archaeologists have documented such practices in parts of Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and elsewhere, though each culture expressed these traditions differently. Could Sanauli preserve evidence of something similar? Some researchers have explored that possibility with caution. A few burials appear more complex than simple individual interments. The positioning of skeletal remains, the arrangement of grave goods, and the proximity of multiple individuals have encouraged questions about whether everyone buried together died naturally. Were they members of the same family, close companions, warriors fallen together, or participants in funerary rituals that required more than one life? The archaeological evidence has not produced definitive answers. Importantly, no clear physical signs conclusively demonstrate ritual execution. Skeletons do not always preserve injuries capable of revealing how death occurred. Organic materials disappear over thousands of years. Ancient funeral customs leave incomplete signatures that archaeologists must interpret carefully. As a result, mainstream scholarship remains appropriately restrained. Most specialists acknowledge that while certain burials are unusual, direct evidence for organized human sacrifice at Sanauli remains inconclusive. Alternative explanations, including simultaneous natural deaths, family burials, or ceremonial interments spread over short periods, remain entirely plausible. Yet, uncertainty itself often becomes part of the mystery. One reason the debate persists is the extraordinary richness of the elite graves.
Some propose that Tarhuntassa's elite evacuated before a catastrophe struck, carrying valuable records and sacred objects to safer territories. Others imagine that later settlements completely obscured the ancient city beneath successive layers of construction, leaving its identity hidden beneath communities still inhabited today. More speculative writers venture further, suggesting that deliberate efforts erased Tarhuntassa from official memory after dynastic conflicts, much as certain rulers elsewhere attempted to remove rivals from history through political damnation and the destruction of monuments. There is little direct evidence supporting such claims. Yet history offers numerous examples where victorious governments reshaped collective memory. Could something similar have occurred here? Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Tarhuntassa is how confidently ancient texts speak about a place modern archaeology struggles to locate. Usually, written records help guide excavation toward physical remains. Here, the documents seem almost to point toward a city perpetually beyond reach. Every newly translated inscription adds another piece to the puzzle. Every excavation tests another possibility. Every failed identification reminds researchers how much of the ancient world still lies concealed beneath the landscape. Standing upon the wide Anatolian plains today, surrounded by quiet fields where shepherds guide their flocks across ground that once supported imperial roads, it is difficult to imagine that somewhere beneath the soil may rest an entire royal capital. Palaces may still sleep beneath wheat fields. Temples may remain sealed below forgotten hills. Clay tablets capable of rewriting Hittite history may wait inside collapsed archives untouched for more than 3,000 years. Until those buried voices are uncovered, Tarhuntassa occupies a rare place between history and absence, a kingdom known by name, remembered by kings, yet hidden so completely that its greatest monuments remain invisible, inviting us to wonder whether its true location has escaped discovery or has simply been waiting patiently for the right generation to find it.
Yet while Sanauli asks us to interpret silent graves, the next mystery is defined by an altogether different silence, the absence of words themselves. Sometimes archaeology uncovers too many clues. At other times it reveals a void where historians expect thousands of voices. Few places illustrate this paradox more clearly than the ancient city of Carchemish, where a powerful kingdom flourished for centuries, yet its most important records seem to have disappeared almost without a trace. On a high bluff overlooking the Euphrates River, where one of the ancient world's most important crossing points linked Anatolia with Mesopotamia and Syria, the ruins of Carchemish still command the landscape. Massive stone gateways, weathered reliefs, defensive walls, and fragments of royal monuments emerge from the earth, reminding visitors that this was once among the greatest cities of the late Bronze and early Iron Ages. For thousands of years, caravans passed through its gates. Armies marched across its bridges. Kings negotiated alliances within its palaces. Few cities occupied a more strategic position. Control of Carchemish meant influence over trade, diplomacy, and military movement across much of the ancient Near East. Hittite rulers valued it immensely. After the collapse of the Hittite Empire around the early 12th century BC, Carchemish survived when many other great cities fell. Rather than disappearing, it evolved into one of the most influential Neo-Hittite kingdoms, preserving traditions that had vanished elsewhere. Its rulers left behind magnificent stone inscriptions. They commissioned monumental sculptures. They celebrated victories. They honored the gods. Yet one category of evidence remains curiously absent: the royal archives. For a city that served as an administrative, diplomatic, and political center for centuries, historians naturally expect the existence of extensive written records. Royal correspondence, tax documents, international treaties, court decisions, religious texts, administrative accounts, the routine paperwork that sustained every major kingdom of the ancient world. Instead, remarkably little has been found. The silence is difficult to ignore. Elsewhere across the ancient Near East, royal archives transformed modern understanding of forgotten civilizations. At Hattusa, thousands of clay tablets reconstructed the political history of the Hittite Empire. At Ugarit, archives illuminated trade, diplomacy, literature, and daily administration. At Mari and Ebla, countless documents revealed kings speaking through letters preserved for millennia beneath collapsed palaces. Carchemish should have yielded something comparable. So, where are its records? The city itself certainly possessed writing. Hieroglyphic Luwian inscriptions appear on monumental stone monuments erected by successive rulers. These carefully carved texts commemorate royal achievements, building projects, military campaigns, and acts of devotion toward the gods. They demonstrate a sophisticated administrative culture capable of producing formal written communication. But monumental inscriptions represent only the public face of government. Behind every inscription should have stood countless working documents. Officials needed records. Merchants required contracts. Governors exchanged correspondence. Priests managed temple property. Royal administrators monitored taxes, labor, and supplies. Such systems cannot function entirely without written administration. Yet, those documents remain largely absent. One explanation lies in the materials themselves. Unlike Mesopotamian kingdoms that relied heavily upon baked clay tablets, Carchemish may have used large quantities of wooden writing boards coated with wax or other perishable materials. Ancient texts from neighboring civilizations frequently mention wooden tablets as practical writing surfaces for everyday administration. If Carchemish favored these materials, the consequences for archaeology would be profound. Wood decays. Wax disappears. Leather deteriorates. Papyrus rarely survives outside exceptionally dry climates. Entire bureaucracies could vanish almost completely. Many historians consider this among the most plausible explanations. Even so, questions remain. Clay tablets almost certainly existed alongside perishable documents. Important treaties, diplomatic correspondence, legal agreements, and archival copies were often preserved in more durable forms. Why have so few emerged? Another possibility concerns the city's long and remarkably complex history. Carchemish remained occupied across multiple civilizations. Successive rebuilding projects transformed large sections of the ancient settlement. New walls rose over older structures. Palaces expanded. Defensive works shifted. Centuries of continuous occupation disturbed earlier architectural layers that might once have contained archives. Could the royal library still lie beneath later construction? Entire palace districts remain only partially excavated. Political circumstances have also complicated archaeological work. For much of the 20th and early 21st centuries, access to the site was limited by changing regional conditions. Large areas remained unexplored for decades. Modern technology, including ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, and refined excavation techniques, is only beginning to reveal features previous generations could not detect. It is entirely possible that the archives simply have not yet been reached. History offers encouraging precedents. The archives of Ebla remained unknown until their discovery transformed Near Eastern studies during the 1970s. Thousands of tablets appeared almost unexpectedly. Before excavation, few imagined such a vast collection still survived. Could Carchemish hold a similar surprise beneath an untouched administrative building? The possibility continues to inspire researchers. The mystery becomes even more intriguing because Carchemish occupied a unique historical position during one of antiquity's greatest transitions. As neighboring kingdoms collapsed during the Bronze Age collapse, Carchemish endured. Its rulers preserved aspects of Hittite political culture while adapting to an entirely new regional landscape. Imagine what a complete royal archive might reveal. How did administrators respond to imperial collapse? What alliances formed as old powers disappeared? How did ordinary officials experience one of history's most dramatic periods of transformation? These questions remain largely unanswered. Some scholars have suggested that archives may have been deliberately removed before military threats reached the city. Throughout history, royal courts often evacuated sacred objects, treasures, and important documents during times of crisis. If Carchemish's rulers anticipated invasion, they may have transported state records to secure locations elsewhere within the kingdom. If true, those archives could still exist, hidden beneath another settlement, stored within an undiscovered fortress, or buried in a sanctuary whose original purpose has long been forgotten. Others favor a less dramatic explanation. Perhaps the archives were simply recycled. Clay tablets could be broken, writing boards reused, buildings dismantled for construction material. Centuries of ordinary urban life gradually erased what once seemed permanent. History does not always disappear through catastrophe. Sometimes it fades through routine. More speculative theories naturally extend beyond the available evidence. Some propose that Carchemish possessed restricted royal collections accessible only to priests and members of the ruling family, housed separately from administrative buildings archaeologists have already excavated. Others imagine hidden underground chambers designed specifically to protect dynastic records during periods of instability. There is currently no archaeological evidence confirming such concealed repositories. Yet, discoveries elsewhere remind historians that remarkable archives occasionally survive in unexpected places. The unanswered questions surrounding Carchemish become even more compelling when considering the city's remarkable artistic legacy. The monumental reliefs depict kings, gods, ceremonies, processions, and mythical creatures with extraordinary detail. Every carved stone hints at stories far richer than the surviving inscriptions alone can tell. Who commissioned these monuments? What debates unfolded within the royal court before they were carved? Which diplomatic negotiations shaped the alliances they celebrated? The stones remain. The conversations are gone. And perhaps that is the greatest irony of archaeology. Entire archives may disappear, while a single forgotten object can survive long enough to raise more questions than thousands of written pages ever could. If Carchemish reminds us how much knowledge has been lost, the ancient city of Enkomi invites us to consider a different mystery, one preserved not in words, but in symbols whose meanings have remained stubbornly beyond our reach. Near the eastern coast of Cyprus, where fertile plains meet the shimmering waters of the Mediterranean, lie the remains of Enkomi. Today, broken foundations and scattered stones rest quietly beneath an open sky. But more than 3,000 years ago, this was one of the island's greatest cities. Merchants arrived from distant kingdoms. Ships crowded its harbors, and workshops transformed Cypriot copper into one of the ancient world's most sought-after commodities. Enkomi stood at the crossroads of civilizations: Egypt, the Aegean, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, the Levant. Ideas traveled here as readily as merchants. Religious beliefs mixed with local traditions. Artistic styles crossed the sea aboard trading vessels. Every generation left its own mark upon the city, creating a cultural landscape unlike almost anywhere else in the Bronze Age Mediterranean. Yet, among the city's many remarkable discoveries, a handful of unusual ritual objects continue to puzzle archaeologists. They are beautifully crafted, carefully preserved, clearly significant. And still, no one can say with certainty exactly what they meant. One of the most famous discoveries is the so-called horned god figurine, a bronze statue standing confidently with one arm raised, wearing an elaborate horned helmet. The figure appears powerful, almost commanding, its stance suggesting authority rather than simple decoration. Nearby excavations also revealed another extraordinary bronze figure, often known as the ingot god, standing upon a copper oxhide ingot, a symbol deeply associated with Cyprus's enormous copper industry. At first glance, these statues seem straightforward. Surely they represent gods, or kings, or priests. But certainty quickly begins to fade. No surviving inscription identifies either figure. No accompanying text explains the rituals surrounding them. No written manual survives to describe the ceremonies in which they once played a role. Instead, archaeologists must reconstruct an entire religious world using only fragments of architecture, scattered offerings, and silent works of art. The horned god immediately attracts attention because horned crowns frequently symbolize divine authority throughout much of the ancient Near East. Gods across Mesopotamia often appeared wearing similar headdresses, their horns announcing supernatural power. Yet, the Enkomi figure differs in important ways. Certain stylistic features resemble local Cypriot traditions, while others hint at influences arriving from Anatolia or the Aegean. Was this an imported deity, a local god adopting foreign artistic conventions? Or evidence that religious identities themselves flowed across the Mediterranean alongside trade? Each possibility remains plausible. The ingot god presents an equally fascinating puzzle. Standing directly upon a copper ingot, the figure creates an unmistakable connection between religion and metallurgy. Copper shaped every aspect of Bronze Age Cyprus. Mines supplied enormous quantities of metal exported across the Mediterranean. Wealth flowed through cities like Enkomi because of this resource. Could the statue represent a divine protector of mining and metalworking? Some scholars think so. Ancient societies commonly associated natural resources with supernatural guardians. Miners often performed rituals before entering dangerous tunnels. Metal workers occupied respected, sometimes mysterious positions within their communities. Transforming raw ore into gleaming bronze must have seemed almost magical. Perhaps the ingot god embodied that transformation. Others remain more cautious. The copper ingot may symbolize prosperity rather than divine function. The figure could represent a ruler claiming authority over trade, a priest conducting ceremonies linked to commerce, or even a heroic ancestor elevated through generations of tradition. Without written explanations, certainty remains impossible. The temples themselves deepen the mystery. Excavations at Enkomi uncovered carefully planned sacred buildings containing altars, offering tables, ash deposits, animal bones, and ritual objects arranged with deliberate precision. Certain rooms appear designed specifically for ceremonial activity. Others contain unusual collections of figurines, pottery, and symbolic artifacts whose original relationships remain difficult to reconstruct. Every object seems intentional. Every placement appears meaningful. Yet the underlying beliefs remain largely invisible. Mainstream archaeology generally views Enkomi as a city where multiple religious traditions coexisted and interacted. Cyprus occupied an ideal geographical position for cultural exchange. Merchants carried more than copper. They transported myths, ceremonies, artistic techniques, and sacred symbols between distant kingdoms. Religious syncretism, the blending of different belief systems, was likely common. A deity worshipped under one name in Anatolia might acquire different characteristics in Cyprus. A local goddess might gradually absorb features from foreign traditions. Over generations, entirely new religious identities could emerge. Such processes make interpretation extraordinarily difficult. When modern archaeologists discover a bronze figurine wearing a horned helmet, are they observing a familiar deity transformed by local customs? Or a uniquely Cypriot god borrowing visual language recognized throughout the Eastern Mediterranean? The answer remains uncertain. Among the smaller discoveries are numerous figurines whose exaggerated features invite still more questions. Some emphasize fertility through enlarged anatomical forms. Others display unusual postures or gestures no longer understood. Tiny clay objects appear in temple deposits alongside luxury goods imported from distant lands. Were these personal offerings left by ordinary worshippers, symbols used during seasonal festivals, objects believed to protect homes and families, or representations of myths that disappeared when their storytellers fell silent? The archaeological record rarely provides direct answers. One particularly intriguing aspect of Enkomi is the apparent relationship between ritual and industry. Unlike many ancient religious centers separated from commercial activity, Enkomi's sacred spaces existed within a thriving manufacturing city. Copper production surrounded daily life. Workshops operated alongside residential districts. Trade connected every neighborhood to distant kingdoms. Could metallurgy itself have held sacred significance? Many ancient cultures regarded metalworking with profound respect. The ability to transform stone-like ore into shining bronze through fire appeared almost miraculous. Furnaces glowed through the night. Molten metal flowed like liquid sunlight. Skilled craftsmen mastered techniques understood by relatively few. Perhaps religious ceremonies honored not merely the finished products, but the mysterious process of creation itself. More speculative theories venture further. Some researchers have suggested that the unusual cult objects preserve traces of forgotten mystery religions whose ceremonies were intentionally kept secret, revealed only to initiated participants. Others imagine priesthoods responsible for safeguarding sacred knowledge connected to astronomy, navigation, or the seasonal rhythms governing maritime trade. There is currently no direct evidence supporting such elaborate interpretations. Yet, the scarcity of written sources leaves considerable room for careful speculation. Others have proposed that certain figurines represent deified ancestors rather than traditional gods. Across many ancient societies, exceptional rulers or revered community leaders gradually assumed sacred roles after death. If Enkomi practiced similar traditions, distinguishing between divine beings and honored humans becomes remarkably difficult. The city's eventual decline adds another layer of uncertainty. Like many centers across the eastern Mediterranean, Enkomi experienced profound disruption during the Bronze Age collapse around the early 12th century BC. Trade networks weakened. Political systems changed. New populations arrived. Older traditions evolved or disappeared altogether. Whatever meanings these ritual objects once carried gradually faded from collective memory. Even later inhabitants may no longer have fully understood the beliefs of those who created them. Standing today among the quiet ruins of Enkomi, with warm Mediterranean winds passing across ancient foundations, it is difficult to imagine the ceremonies that once animated these sacred spaces. Bronze statues may have reflected the light of flickering oil lamps. Priests may have spoken prayers in languages no longer heard. Offerings of grain, wine, incense, or precious metals may have filled temple courtyards while ships waited in nearby harbors for favorable winds. The objects remain. The rituals have vanished. Each figurine, each altar, each carefully placed offering survives like a sentence from a forgotten language, grammatically complete, beautifully preserved, yet missing the key needed to understand its true meaning. And perhaps somewhere beneath the unexcavated layers of Enkomi, another temple still waits, holding the one inscription or overlooked artifact capable of transforming these mysterious cult objects from silent symbols into voices that can finally tell their own story. And just as the sacred objects of Enkomi preserve a religion whose language has faded with time, entire kingdoms can survive only as scattered names etched into ancient treaties and royal inscriptions. Their borders dissolve, their capitals disappear, and their rulers become little more than echoes. Among the most elusive of these forgotten realms is a kingdom that once stood between empires, shaping the politics of Western Anatolia before slipping almost completely beyond history's reach. Western Anatolia is a landscape of dramatic contrasts. Rugged mountains descend toward fertile river valleys that eventually open onto the Aegean coast. Olive groves, forests, and winding rivers have sustained human settlement for thousands of years, while natural corridors through the hills created vital routes connecting inland kingdoms with maritime trade. It was a region where cultures met, where alliances shifted quickly, and where even small kingdoms could influence the ambitions of great empires. Somewhere within this landscape lay the kingdom of Mira. Unlike legendary lands that belong entirely to myth, Mira appears repeatedly in historical records from the Hittite Empire. Kings negotiated with its rulers. Military campaigns crossed its territory. Diplomatic treaties defined its obligations and privileges. It was unquestionably real. Yet, despite these references, historians still cannot identify its boundaries with complete confidence. Its capital remains uncertain. Its royal palaces have not been conclusively found. Its story survives only in fragments. The earliest mentions of Mira emerge from Hittite records during the Late Bronze Age, when Western Anatolia consisted of a patchwork of kingdoms balancing their independence against the growing influence of powerful neighbors. Rather than governing the entire region directly, Hittite rulers often relied upon local kings who accepted imperial authority while retaining considerable control over their own territories. Mira became one of these important client kingdoms. Its rulers pledged loyalty to the Hittite Great King. In return, they received recognition, protection, and a degree of political autonomy. This arrangement appears stable on the surface. But beneath official diplomacy lay a landscape of constant uncertainty. Western Anatolia rarely remained politically quiet for long. Neighboring kingdoms competed for influence. Coastal regions attracted foreign interests from across the Aegean. Local dynasties formed alliances that could change within a single generation. In this environment, Mira occupied a strategic position that made it both valuable and vulnerable. One of the most informative sources concerning Mira is the famous Manapa Tarhunta letter, written by one of its rulers to the Hittite king. The letter reveals a kingdom struggling with internal instability, regional conflict, and outside pressure. Its ruler speaks almost personally, describing political difficulties and seeking support from the Hittite court. The tone feels remarkably familiar. Behind formal diplomatic language stands an individual attempting to preserve his kingdom during uncertain times. The letter reminds us that ancient kingdoms were not abstract political entities. They were governed by people making difficult decisions with incomplete information, much as leaders do today. Another important figure connected with Mira is Kupanta Kurunta, whose name appears in Hittite treaties defining territorial arrangements and political responsibilities. These documents suggest that Mira exercised influence over neighboring lands and played an active role in maintaining stability along the empire's western frontier. Yet they also raise questions. How large was Mira truly? Did its authority extend all the way to the Aegean coast, or was it concentrated farther inland, controlling only key river valleys and mountain passes? The surviving texts offer clues, but not enough certainty. Modern scholars generally place Mira somewhere in western Anatolia, often associating it with the valleys of the Meander or Gades rivers. Others argue for locations farther south or farther north, based upon differing interpretations of geographical references preserved in Hittite documents. Each reconstruction explains certain passages. Each encounters contradictions elsewhere. Without discovering a royal archive or an inscription clearly identifying a capital, every proposed map remains provisional. Archaeology has added intriguing pieces without solving the larger puzzle. Several late Bronze Age settlements across western Anatolia display evidence of substantial political organization during the appropriate period. Fortified centers, administrative buildings, imported goods, and regional trade all point toward prosperous kingdoms interacting with the wider eastern Mediterranean. Could one of these sites be Mira? Perhaps. Yet none has produced definitive inscriptions declaring, "This is the capital of Mira." The kingdom remains strangely anonymous. Its political importance becomes even more fascinating when viewed alongside another enduring mystery of Western Anatolia, the kingdom known as Wilusa, widely associated by many scholars with the region later remembered in Greek tradition as Troy. Hittite documents occasionally mention Mira and Wilusa within the same broader political landscape. Their rulers likely knew one another. They negotiated, cooperated, perhaps even competed. If so, Mira may have stood remarkably close to events that later inspired some of the Mediterranean's greatest legendary traditions. Did merchants from Mira visit coastal cities that later entered epic poetry? Did its soldiers march beside neighboring kingdoms during regional conflicts? Could its diplomats have witnessed political events that gradually evolved into stories retold for centuries? No surviving record answers these questions directly, but the possibilities are difficult to ignore. Then, as with so many Bronze Age kingdoms, the historical trail begins to fade. Around the early 12th century BC, the interconnected political system that had dominated the eastern Mediterranean for centuries entered a period of profound transformation. Great empires fragmented, trade networks contracted, palace economies weakened. Written records became increasingly scarce. The Hittite Empire collapsed, and Mira disappeared with it. No surviving chronicle records its final days. No inscription commemorates its last ruler. No defeated king describes conquering its capital. It simply vanishes from the historical record. Mainstream historians generally view Mira's disappearance as part of the wider Bronze Age collapse. Rather than one catastrophic event, they envision overlapping pressures: regional warfare, political fragmentation, environmental stress, migration, and economic disruption gradually dismantling established kingdoms. Within this broader process, Mira likely lost the imperial framework that had helped sustain its political identity. Without Hittite administration, regional kingdoms reorganized, merged, or dissolved into emerging Iron Age societies. Yet, alternative possibilities remain. Some archaeologists wonder whether Mira survived under a different name. Political identities often changed more rapidly than populations themselves. A kingdom might retain its people, cities, and traditions while adopting a new ruling dynasty or political title. If this occurred, Mira may never have truly disappeared. Its name simply changed. Others suggest that the kingdom fragmented into smaller local powers, each inheriting portions of its territory while abandoning the centralized authority that once defined it. History frequently preserves the names of empires. It often forgets the communities that continued living after those empires ended. More speculative interpretations move further beyond conventional scholarship. Some writers have imagined that Mira controlled a sophisticated network of inland sanctuaries or administrative centers still awaiting discovery beneath modern settlements. Others propose that important archives remain buried within unexplored citadels capable of clarifying not only Mira's geography, but also the political landscape surrounding Western Anatolia during the final centuries of the Bronze Age. At present, such ideas remain possibilities rather than conclusions. The archaeological evidence has not yet spoken decisively. Perhaps what makes Mira so compelling is its unusual balance between visibility and absence. We know its kings negotiated with emperors. We know treaties recognized its borders. We know diplomats considered it important enough to record repeatedly. And yet we still cannot confidently point to its capital on a map. It is a kingdom simultaneously documented and missing. Standing today among the rolling hills and fertile valleys of Western Anatolia, It is easy to imagine caravans winding through mountain passes, royal messengers carrying sealed tablets between distant courts, and fortified towns watching the horizon for signs of allies or enemies. Somewhere beneath these landscapes may rest the palace where Mira's rulers governed, the temples where its priests performed forgotten ceremonies, and the archives that could finally reveal the kingdom's true extent and its role within one of history's most interconnected worlds. Until those discoveries emerge from the earth, the kingdom of Mira remains suspended between certainty and mystery, a place known to ancient kings, acknowledged in treaties, and woven into the political fabric of the Bronze Age, yet still waiting for the moment when archaeology may finally restore its lost voice. And perhaps that is the thread connecting so many of these forgotten kingdoms. Their cities disappear, their rulers fade from memory, yet the people themselves often leave behind traces that refuse to fit neatly into history's established narrative. Sometimes those traces appear not as monuments or royal inscriptions, but as entirely new communities arriving along familiar shores. It is here, on the eastern Mediterranean coast, that another enduring mystery begins, one surrounding the people known in ancient Egyptian records as the Peleset. Along the broad coastal plain of the southern Levant, the Mediterranean rolls steadily onto long stretches of sand, while fertile valleys extend inland toward low hills and ancient trade routes. For thousands of years, this coastline served as one of the great crossroads of the ancient world. Merchant ships anchored in sheltered bays. Caravans crossed between Egypt, Syria, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia. Kingdoms rose, competed, and disappeared, each leaving fragments buried beneath layers of later settlements. Among those fragments lies one of the late Bronze Age's most intriguing puzzles. Before the region became known as Philistia, who exactly were the Peleset? Where did they first settle? And what happened during those earliest years before history begins to recognize them as one of the dominant peoples of the southern coast? Unlike many ancient societies that introduce themselves through their own written records, the Peleset first appear in the inscriptions of others. Their most famous mention comes from the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses III during the early 12th century BC. Carved upon the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu are vivid scenes depicting dramatic conflicts against groups collectively remembered as the Sea Peoples. Among them are the Peleset. The reliefs portray warriors wearing distinctive feathered headdresses, carrying round shields and long swords. They appear not only as fighters but also alongside wagons, women, and children, suggesting movements involving entire communities rather than simply military expeditions. It is a remarkable image, not merely an invading army, but a migrating population. The Egyptian inscriptions describe victory, yet they also imply something larger unfolding across the eastern Mediterranean, a world in motion. Around the same period, many of the great Bronze Age kingdoms entered a time of extraordinary upheaval. Palaces burned, trade networks weakened, long-established political systems fractured. Cities that had flourished for centuries were abandoned or rebuilt under entirely different circumstances. Within this wider transformation, the Peleset emerged. But their earliest settlements remained surprisingly difficult to reconstruct. Mainstream archaeology associates the later Philistine cities with sites such as Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza along the southern Levantine coast in what is now Palestine. Excavations at these locations reveal significant cultural changes beginning around the early 12th century BC. New styles of pottery appeared. Architectural traditions shifted. Food preparation methods evolved. Decorative motifs reflected influences unfamiliar to earlier local communities. The archaeological record clearly indicates change. Yet, change alone does not explain identity. Were these entirely new populations arriving from overseas? existing communities adopting foreign customs, or a gradual blending of newcomers and local inhabitants. The evidence continues to support several possibilities simultaneously. Among the most recognizable discoveries is a distinctive ceramic tradition often called Philistine pottery. Early examples closely resemble Mycenaean pottery produced in the Aegean world during the Late Bronze Age. Similar shapes, decorative patterns, and manufacturing techniques suggest connections extending far across the Mediterranean. This resemblance has encouraged one of the leading interpretations. Perhaps at least part of the Peleset population originated somewhere within the Aegean. The idea gains support from additional evidence. Certain architectural features resemble those known from Aegean settlements. Some cooking techniques differ from earlier local traditions. Even dietary practices appear to have shifted in noticeable ways. Together, these clues suggest that newcomers may indeed have arrived from overseas. Yet, archaeology rarely offers simple answers. Recent genetic studies conducted on ancient human remains from Philistine period cemeteries have introduced fascinating complexity. Some individuals display evidence of ancestry connected to southern Europe or the Aegean during the earliest settlement phases. However, this genetic signature appears to diminish within only a few generations, indicating extensive interaction and intermarriage with local populations. If this interpretation is correct, the Peleset were neither entirely foreign nor entirely indigenous. They became something new, a society formed through cultural fusion. Still, questions remain. If migrants crossed the Mediterranean, where exactly did they first arrive? Did they establish temporary coastal camps before building permanent cities? Did they settle peacefully in abandoned regions following the Bronze Age collapse? Or did they occupy existing communities already weakened by decades of political instability? The archaeological evidence preserves only fragments of those earliest years. One possibility suggests that the first Peleset settlements may now lie beneath later urban occupation. Coastal cities remained continuously inhabited for centuries, meaning the earliest layers often rest deep beneath massive accumulations of later construction. Excavating such levels presents enormous technical challenges. Entire neighborhoods from the first generation of settlement may still remain untouched. Another possibility is that the earliest communities were surprisingly modest. Perhaps the newcomers initially lived in temporary encampments, wooden structures, or lightly built villages that left relatively limited archaeological traces. Only later, as their political organization strengthened, did the familiar urban centers of Philistia emerge. If so, archaeology may be searching for evidence far subtler than monumental architecture. The written record offers little additional clarity. Egyptian inscriptions emphasize conflict. Later, biblical traditions describe interactions between Philistines and neighboring peoples. Yet, neither source explains the earliest stages of settlement in meaningful detail. The voices of the settlers themselves remain almost entirely absent. No founding inscription survives. No migration narrative has been discovered. No royal archive describes the first generation arriving upon these shores. Instead, archaeologists must reconstruct history through pottery fragments, animal bones, building foundations, and changing patterns of daily life. Some of the most intriguing evidence comes from food remains. Zoo archaeological studies indicate that pigs became significantly more common within early Philistine settlements than in many neighboring communities. This dietary pattern has attracted considerable attention because food traditions often preserve cultural identity even during periods of migration. Did these practices reflect memories carried across the sea, or practical adaptations to new environments? Even ordinary meals become historical clues. More speculative theories extend beyond the current evidence. Some writers imagine the Peleset as survivors of collapsing Bronze Age kingdoms who united under entirely new leadership after their homelands fell into chaos. Others suggest they represented only one branch of a much broader maritime network connecting displaced populations throughout the Mediterranean. There are even proposals linking them with legendary migrations preserved in later Greek traditions. Such ideas remain intriguing but unconfirmed. The available evidence supports movement and cultural interaction. It does not fully explain every detail of origin. Perhaps the greatest mystery lies not in where the Peleset came from, but in how rapidly they established a recognizable cultural identity. Within only a few generations, they had developed distinctive cities, local industries, religious traditions, and political structures while simultaneously absorbing influences from the surrounding Levant. They were changing, even as they preserved elements of older traditions. Standing today among the archaeological remains of the southern coastal plain of Palestine, where ancient walls emerge beneath centuries of accumulated history, it is possible to imagine ships appearing on the Mediterranean horizon during those uncertain decades following the Bronze Age collapse. Families may have stepped onto unfamiliar shores carrying treasured possessions, inherited beliefs, unfamiliar languages, and memories of distant homelands now lost to history. Others, already living along the coast, may have welcomed them, resisted them, traded with them, or gradually merged with them. Those first encounters transformed the region forever. Yet the opening chapter of that story remains incomplete. Beneath the earliest settlement layers, beneath later cities and centuries of rebuilding, evidence may still wait to reveal where the Peleset first established their homes before Philistia emerged as a recognizable kingdom. Until then, their origins remain suspended between archaeology and memory, inviting us to wonder whether the next discovery will illuminate not only who the Peleset were, but how entirely new civilizations can arise from the aftermath of an ancient world's collapse. And if the earliest Peleset settlements remind us that entire peoples can emerge from the uncertainty left by collapsing civilizations, the deserts to the south preserve a different kind of mystery, one written not in cities or pottery, but in stones deliberately arranged across an almost timeless landscape. Here, where silence dominates the horizon, the questions become even older. Who placed these stones? What ceremonies once unfolded among them? And why did generations return to this remote mountain long before written history could explain their purpose? Far from the fertile river valleys and bustling coastal ports of the ancient Near East, the landscape surrounding Karkom rises from the barren wilderness with quiet authority. Winds sweep across broad gravel plains, while jagged ridges cast long shadows over an environment that appears almost untouched by time. Rain is rare, vegetation is sparse, distances seem endless. Yet, despite its isolation, this mountain has drawn human visitors for thousands of years. To modern travelers, Karkom may seem an unlikely destination. To ancient people, it appears to have been something very different. Scattered across its slopes and surrounding plateau are hundreds of archaeological features. Stone circles, small shrines, standing stones, cairns, altars, campsites, pathways, rock carvings. Together, they form one of the most remarkable concentrations of prehistoric ritual remains found anywhere in the Sinai Negev region. The sheer number of sacred features immediately raises a profound question. Why here? Why would communities repeatedly travel into such an unforgiving landscape generation after generation? The mountain itself offers few practical advantages. It is not especially fertile. It commands no major river. Permanent settlement would have been difficult. Yet, archaeological surveys have identified thousands of rock engravings and hundreds of ritual installations spanning several periods, particularly during the 4th and 3rd millennia BC. This was not an accidental stopping place. people came intentionally, again and again. Among the most intriguing discoveries are the stone circles scattered across the surrounding plateau. Some consist of carefully arranged rings of rocks enclosing open spaces. Others incorporate standing stones or small central features whose original functions remain uncertain. Their construction reflects planning rather than chance. Individual stones were selected, transported, and deliberately positioned. But for what purpose? Mainstream archaeology generally interprets many of these circles as ritual installations connected with ceremonial gatherings, seasonal worship, territorial markers, or funerary traditions. Similar stone structures appear elsewhere across the ancient Near East, where they often served symbolic rather than domestic functions. Yet Karkom presents an unusual concentration. Instead of one isolated sanctuary, the mountain appears surrounded by an entire sacred landscape. Perhaps the mountain itself held spiritual significance. Across countless ancient cultures, elevated places became natural locations for encounters between the human and divine. Mountains touched the sky. Storms gathered around their peaks. Their commanding presence inspired reverence long before formal temples emerged within cities. Karkom certainly possesses such an atmosphere. Standing upon its heights, surrounded by vast desert horizons stretching in every direction, it becomes easy to understand why prehistoric communities might have viewed this place differently from the ordinary world below. The rock art reinforces this impression. Thousands of engravings decorate nearby surfaces. Wild animals appear alongside human figures, hunting scenes, geometric symbols, footprints, weapons, and mysterious abstract designs. Some carvings seem straightforward. Others resist interpretation. Certain symbols repeat frequently enough to suggest shared traditions. Yet their precise meanings remain unknown. Were they prayers, pilgrims' signatures, clan symbols, sacred narratives expressed without writing? The stones remain silent. Dating the various features presents another challenge. Karkom was not used during a single moment in history but across many centuries. Different communities returned repeatedly, leaving new structures beside older ones. Some circles may have been reused. Others modified. Certain shrines expanded while neighboring installations gradually disappeared beneath drifting sediment. The result is a sacred landscape layered across generations, each period adding another chapter, without erasing the previous one. One particularly intriguing aspect is the apparent organization of some ritual areas. Standing stones occasionally appear aligned with pathways or open gathering spaces. Small altars constructed from stacked stones occupy prominent positions overlooking surrounding valleys. Cairns rise along natural approaches to the mountain, perhaps guiding visitors toward significant ceremonial locations. The arrangement rarely appears random. It suggests movement, procession, purpose. Mainstream researchers generally avoid assigning overly specific meanings to these features because direct evidence remains limited. No written texts explain the ceremonies. Organic materials capable of revealing offerings rarely survive in the harsh environment. Ritual activity often leaves subtle archaeological traces difficult to reconstruct after several thousand years. Nevertheless, the concentration of sacred architecture strongly indicates that Karkom functioned as an important ceremonial center for prehistoric pastoral communities moving across the surrounding deserts. Exactly how those ceremonies unfolded remains uncertain. The mountain's isolation has naturally encouraged broader speculation. One of the most widely discussed proposals was advanced by Italian archaeologist Emanuele Anati, who suggested that Karkom might correspond to the biblical Mount Sinai. His argument drew attention because the site contains an extraordinary density of ancient ritual remains, including altars, standing stones, and evidence for repeated ceremonial activity. If correct, such an identification would dramatically reshape traditional understandings of biblical geography. Most scholars, however, remain unconvinced. The primary reason concerns chronology. Many of Karkom's most significant ritual features date considerably earlier than the periods traditionally associated with the biblical Exodus narrative. While the mountain was unquestionably important during prehistory, linking it directly to Mount Sinai requires assumptions that the archaeological evidence has not definitively confirmed. Still, the proposal illustrates how extraordinary the site appears. Few mountains preserve such extensive evidence of long-term ritual significance. Other speculative interpretations move in different directions. Some researchers have wondered whether the stone circles served astronomical purposes, marking seasonal changes or significant celestial events important for pastoral calendars. Across many ancient societies, ceremonial architecture occasionally aligned with the rising or setting sun during solstices or equinoxes. At Karkom, certain arrangements have invited similar questions. Yet, proving intentional astronomical alignment is notoriously difficult. Patterns visible today may result from coincidence rather than deliberate design. Without supporting evidence, such interpretations remain possibilities rather than conclusions. Others imagine Karkom as a regional pilgrimage center visited by multiple communities speaking different languages, but sharing certain religious traditions. Rather than belonging to one tribe or kingdom, the mountain may have functioned as neutral, sacred ground, where ceremonies transcended ordinary political boundaries. The archaeological evidence cannot fully confirm this idea. Neither can it entirely exclude it. Perhaps what makes Karkom so compelling is the absence of ordinary settlement. The mountain appears to have attracted repeated visitation without developing into a large permanent town. People journeyed here, performed rituals, left offerings, built monuments, then departed. The sacred remained. The visitors changed. Standing today among the weathered stone circles, surrounded by endless desert silence, it is difficult not to sense the immense passage of time. The same winds that move across the plateau today once carried the voices of pilgrims climbing toward the summit. Fires may have flickered beside carefully constructed altars beneath brilliant night skies untouched by artificial light. Processions may have crossed the gravel plains carrying objects, songs, and beliefs that vanished long before written history began preserving human memory. The circles themselves reveal almost nothing directly. No inscriptions identify their builders. And perhaps that is the enduring lesson of places like Karkom. Sacred landscapes may preserve monuments long after the names of their builders have been forgotten. But elsewhere in the ancient world, the opposite occurred. Great cities survived, their harbors remained active, and their influence spread across distant seas, while the identities of the rulers who shaped their earliest history slowly disappeared into silence. Few places embody this mystery more completely than the island city of Tyre. Just offshore, along the eastern Mediterranean coast in present-day Lebanon, the ancient island of Tyre once rose from the sea like a natural fortress. Waves crashed against rocky shores while merchant vessels crowded its harbors, carrying cedar timber, purple-dyed textiles, glass, metals, and luxury goods to kingdoms hundreds of miles away. From Egypt to Cyprus, from Anatolia to the distant western Mediterranean, Tyre became synonymous with maritime skill, commerce, and extraordinary wealth. To later civilizations, Tyre appeared almost timeless. Yet its earliest royal history is anything but clear. Long before classical writers celebrated Phoenician sailors crossing vast stretches of open water, before colonies appeared across the Mediterranean, and before Tyre became one of antiquity's greatest trading powers, kings ruled this island city whose names have almost entirely vanished. Who were they? What dynasties transformed a coastal settlement into a maritime kingdom capable of reshaping Mediterranean history? And why has so little survived to identify the rulers responsible for that remarkable rise? Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, where monumental inscriptions often celebrated generations of kings, early Tyre left remarkably few royal records. The city's long history of continuous occupation complicated archaeology from the very beginning. Each generation rebuilt upon the remains of the last. Ancient streets disappeared beneath newer construction. Temples expanded. Defensive walls shifted. Harbors evolved as coastlines gradually changed. The earliest layers remain deeply buried. Some may never be fully accessible. This presents an extraordinary challenge. The city that later influenced much of the Mediterranean still conceals the identities of many of its first rulers beneath thousands of years of uninterrupted urban life. Historical references offer tantalizing glimpses. Egyptian texts from the late Bronze Age mention coastal cities widely associated with the Phoenician world, demonstrating that the region participated actively in international diplomacy centuries before Tyre reached its greatest prominence. The famous Amarna letters preserve correspondence between local rulers and the Egyptian court, revealing complex political relationships throughout the Levant. Yet, Tyre itself appears only in fragments. Individual rulers emerge briefly, then disappear. Their genealogies remain incomplete, their achievements largely unknown. By the early Iron Age, Tyre had clearly become one of the dominant powers along the eastern Mediterranean. Later, classical historians preserved lists of Phoenician kings, including figures such as Abibal, Hiram I, and Ithobal, whose names became associated with monumental building projects, expanding trade, and diplomatic relationships extending across the ancient world. Hiram I, in particular, occupies a prominent place in both historical traditions and later literary accounts. He is remembered as an energetic ruler who strengthened Tyre's harbors, expanded construction, and fostered commercial networks that reached extraordinary distances. But Hiram did not create Tyre from nothing. He inherited something already formidable. Someone came before him. Perhaps many generations came before him. Their names are the true mystery. Mainstream historians generally agree that Tyre's emergence as a major maritime center required centuries of gradual development. Harbors do not become international trading hubs overnight. Shipbuilding traditions evolve over generations. Commercial relationships require stability, experienced leadership, and careful diplomacy. This implies that capable rulers governed Tyre long before the better-known kings entered surviving history. Yet, the archaeological record rarely introduces them. One explanation is preservation. Unlike the baked clay archives of Mesopotamia, many Phoenician records were likely written on papyrus, parchment, or wooden writing boards. Such materials survive only under exceptional environmental conditions. Humid coastal climates rarely preserve organic documents for thousands of years. Entire royal administrations may simply have decayed, letters dissolved, genealogies vanished, state archives returned to the earth. Another possibility concerns the city itself. Modern Tyre occupies much of the ancient landscape. Continuous habitation has protected the site from complete destruction, while simultaneously limiting extensive excavation. Beneath modern streets, houses, and infrastructure may rest earlier palaces, administrative buildings, temples, and archives still untouched by archaeology. The earliest royal quarter may remain exactly where it always stood, hidden beneath later centuries. Waiting. The sea itself adds another layer to the mystery. Ancient Tyre originally occupied an offshore island separated from the mainland. Over time, natural sedimentation and later engineering projects transformed the coastline dramatically. The famous causeway constructed during Alexander the Great's siege permanently altered local geography, eventually joining the island to the mainland. Marine archaeology has revealed portions of ancient harbors beneath the surrounding waters. But underwater excavation remains exceptionally challenging. Could early royal buildings now rest beneath submerged sediments? Might parts of the original shoreline conceal structures connected with Tyre's first kings? The possibility cannot be dismissed. Archaeological discoveries from neighboring Phoenician cities demonstrate that coastal kingdoms possessed sophisticated administrative systems, monumental temples, and extensive commercial infrastructure. By analogy, Tyre almost certainly maintained similar institutions. Its rulers coordinated fleets, negotiated international trade, oversaw craftsmen producing the celebrated purple dye extracted from marine mollusks, managed timber shipments from the cedar forests, directed diplomatic relations stretching across the eastern Mediterranean. Such responsibilities required organized government, and organized government leaves records. So, where are they? Some scholars suggest that repeated rebuilding systematically erased the earliest royal architecture. Valuable stone blocks were frequently reused in later construction. Foundations disappeared beneath new temples and fortifications. Unlike abandoned cities preserved beneath desert sands, thriving ports constantly reinvented themselves. Success became archaeology's greatest obstacle. The city survived. Its earliest history did not. The mystery becomes even more compelling when considering Tyre's remarkable cultural influence. Phoenician merchants carried their alphabet, artistic traditions, religious practices, and commercial expertise throughout the Mediterranean. Colonies eventually appeared in Cyprus, North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, and beyond. Every expansion reflected political leadership at home, yet the architects of that transformation remain largely anonymous. Who first envisioned Tyre as more than a local harbor? Who invested in larger fleets? Who forged alliances with neighboring kingdoms? Who encouraged voyages beyond familiar coastlines? The answers remain frustratingly incomplete. Naturally, the absence of evidence has inspired broader speculation. Some researchers have proposed that Tyre's earliest monarchy emerged from the union of several influential merchant families rather than a single hereditary dynasty. Maritime commerce often concentrated wealth among powerful trading elites, making collective leadership conceivable during the city's formative years. Others imagine forgotten dynasties whose memory disappeared during later political transitions, intentionally or otherwise. Across the ancient world, victorious rulers occasionally emphasized their own legitimacy while allowing earlier lineages to fade from public remembrance. There is little direct evidence that such deliberate erasure occurred at Tyre. Still, history offers many examples where royal memory proved surprisingly fragile. More speculative interpretations venture further still. Some writers have suggested that the earliest rulers preserved sacred maritime traditions inherited from even older Bronze Age coastal societies whose identities dissolved during the Bronze Age collapse. Under this view, Tyre's later greatness represented not an entirely new beginning, but the continuation of knowledge quietly transmitted across generations through sailors, craftsmen, and priestly families. It is an intriguing possibility, one that remains impossible to confirm. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Tyre is how visible its achievements remain while its founders remain almost invisible. Ships crossed the Mediterranean because someone organized them. Harbors expanded because someone ordered their construction. Trade flourished because someone established trust between distant kingdoms. History remembers the city. And perhaps that is the most unsettling pattern in ancient history. Kingdom after kingdom rises into prominence, appears in treaties, royal letters, and diplomatic exchanges, only to dissolve so completely that later generations struggle to determine not only how they fell, but whether they left behind anything at all. Few vanished realms illustrate this quiet disappearance more hauntingly than the kingdom of Amuru, a state that once stood at the very center of the late Bronze Age's shifting balance of power before fading into silence. Along the rugged coastline and rolling hills of what is now western Syria, narrow valleys descend toward the Mediterranean, while mountains create natural barriers between inland kingdoms and the sea. Olive trees, forests, and fertile plains once supported prosperous communities connected by caravan roads stretching north into Anatolia, south toward Palestine, and east into Mesopotamia. It was a land where merchants exchanged luxury goods, envoys carried sealed diplomatic letters, and rival empires competed for influence over every strategic pass and harbor. Somewhere within this landscape flourished the kingdom of Amuru. Unlike many forgotten states known only through archaeology, Amuru appears repeatedly in surviving diplomatic correspondence. Egyptian pharaohs discussed it. Hittite kings negotiated over it. Local rulers defended it, betrayed allies, and shifted loyalties as political fortunes changed across the eastern Mediterranean. For a time, Amuru stood at the crossroads of nearly every major power in the late Bronze Age. And then, it disappeared. The earliest references to Amuru portray not a rigidly defined kingdom, but a frontier region inhabited by communities whose political identity gradually evolved. During the 14th century BC, the famous Amarna letters reveal Amuru as a contested territory where ambitious local rulers navigated the competing ambitions of Egypt and the Hittite Empire. One name emerges repeatedly: Abdi Ashirta. He appears as a remarkably capable leader who expanded his influence through diplomacy, military action, and carefully calculated alliances. Egyptian officials frequently complained about his growing authority, accusing him of undermining neighboring rulers and extending his control across the region. Whether viewed as a rebel, an opportunist, or the founder of an emerging kingdom, Abdi Ashirta transformed Amuru into a significant political force. His son, Aziru, proved equally remarkable. Initially maintaining formal loyalty to Egypt, Aziru eventually shifted allegiance to the Hittites after recognizing the changing balance of power. His correspondence preserved within the Amarna archive reveals a ruler balancing promises, delays, negotiations, and calculated political maneuvering with extraordinary skill. Reading these letters today feels surprisingly modern. Every message reflects uncertainty. Every decision carries enormous risk. The survival of an entire kingdom depended upon choosing the right allies at precisely the right moment. For a time, that strategy worked. Under Hittite protection, Amuru prospered as a valuable buffer state separating great empires. Its rulers maintained considerable autonomy while acknowledging Hittite authority. Treaties defined obligations, borders, military responsibilities, and dynastic succession with remarkable precision. Unlike many smaller kingdoms, Amuru was not insignificant. Its location made it indispensable. Whoever controlled Amuru gained influence over important coastal routes linking Anatolia with the southern Levant. Armies moving between great powers often crossed its territory. Merchant caravans depended upon its roads. Diplomats regularly passed through its settlements carrying messages capable of shaping international politics. Yet, despite this importance, one fundamental mystery remains unresolved. Where was the true heart of Amuru? Unlike capitals such as Hattusa or Ugarit, no universally accepted royal capital of Amuru has been identified. Several archaeological sites have been proposed, each matching portions of the historical evidence while leaving significant questions unanswered. Perhaps the kingdom functioned through multiple regional centers. Perhaps its capital shifted during different reigns. Or perhaps its principal administrative city still lies buried beneath an unexplored mound somewhere in western Syria. Without discovering royal archives or unmistakable inscriptions, certainty remains beyond reach. The kingdom itself seems strangely elusive. Its rulers speak through foreign archives. Its own voice remains largely absent. Then came the great upheaval that transformed the Eastern Mediterranean. Around the early 12th century BC, the interconnected world of the Late Bronze Age entered a period of profound instability. International trade weakened. Palace economies fractured. Long-distance diplomacy became increasingly difficult. Great kingdoms that had dominated the region for centuries either collapsed or struggled to survive. The Hittite Empire disintegrated. Ugarit was destroyed. Trade routes that once connected dozens of kingdoms began to fail. Amuru stood directly within this unfolding crisis, and after this period, its name virtually disappears. No dramatic inscription records its final battle. No surviving chronicle describes its destruction. No neighboring king proudly announces its conquest in unmistakable terms. It simply fades from the historical record. Mainstream historians generally interpret this disappearance as part of the wider Bronze Age collapse. Amuru's political identity depended heavily upon the international system that had sustained it. Once the Hittite Empire fragmented and regional trade networks unraveled, smaller client kingdoms may have lost the structures supporting their existence. Without imperial administration, without reliable commerce, without diplomatic stability, Amuru may simply have ceased to function as an independent kingdom. Yet archaeology rarely favors simple explanations. Some settlements associated with the region revealed destruction by fire. Others continued into the Iron Age with varying degrees of continuity. Certain communities appear abandoned. Others adapted and survived. The collapse unfolded unevenly. Its effects differed from place to place. This complexity has encouraged alternative interpretations. Some researchers wonder whether Amuru's ruling dynasty survived under another political identity after the collapse, preserving local authority while abandoning the old kingdom's name. Throughout history, political systems have often changed faster than populations themselves. Kingdoms disappeared on paper, while communities continued much as before. Could Amuru have quietly evolved into something historians no longer recognize? Others suggest that the kingdom fragmented into smaller chiefdoms, whose individual histories became impossible to trace once centralized administration disappeared. There are also broader theories concerning migration during the Bronze Age collapse. As populations moved throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, Amuru's territory may have experienced waves of newcomers integrating with existing communities. Rather than ending suddenly, the kingdom's identity may have gradually dissolved through cultural transformation. Its people remained, its political name vanished. More speculative ideas extend even further. Some writers have imagined hidden inland refuges where the royal family attempted to preserve authority after coastal cities became increasingly vulnerable. Others suggest that important archives were removed before political collapse, carried into mountain strongholds that remain undiscovered today. There is currently no archaeological evidence confirming such possibilities. Still, the absence of definitive evidence leaves room for careful curiosity. Perhaps what makes Amuru especially haunting is the contrast between its former importance and its eventual silence. During the Late Bronze Age, kings negotiated over its territory. Diplomats debated its loyalties. Treaties carefully defined its borders. Then, within only a relatively short period. The kingdom became almost invisible. Standing today among the hills and coastal valleys of western Syria, it is difficult to imagine the diplomatic drama that once unfolded across this landscape. Royal messengers may have hurried along winding roads carrying clay tablets sealed with official insignia. Fortified towns may have watched the horizon for approaching armies. Palace courtyards may have echoed with conversations determining whether Amuru would align with Egypt or the Hittite Empire, decisions influencing the fate of entire generations. Those voices are now silent. The roads remain. The hills remain. But the kingdom itself survives only through scattered references preserved in foreign archives. Perhaps somewhere beneath an untouched mound rests the palace of Amuru's forgotten kings, its archives still sealed beneath collapsed walls, waiting to reveal how one of the late Bronze Age's most strategically important kingdoms truly ended. Until that discovery is made, the disappearance of Amuru remains one of history's quietest enigmas, reminding us that sometimes the most influential places are not those that leave behind the greatest monuments, but those whose absence leaves the deepest questions unanswered. And if the kingdom of Amuru reminds us how political powers can disappear while their landscapes endure, the next mystery shifts our attention from forgotten kingdoms to forgotten industries. Hidden within an unforgiving desert lies evidence of an enterprise so vast that it once transformed mountains into fuel, stone into metal, and ordinary labor into the foundation of regional power. Yet, the people who made it possible remain almost entirely unknown. Deep within the arid valleys of southern Jordan, where jagged sandstone cliffs rise above dry riverbeds and scorching winds sweep across the landscape, stands the archaeological site of Khirbat en-Nahas. From a distance, it appears little different from the surrounding desert, a scattering of ancient stone walls, collapsed structures, and dark mounds covering the ground. But those black hills are not natural. They are mountains of slag, the silent remains of one of the largest copper-smelting centers in the ancient Near East. For centuries, generations of workers extracted copper ore from nearby mines, fed roaring furnaces with enormous quantities of charcoal, and transformed raw stone into one of the Bronze and Iron Age's most valuable resources. Copper shaped weapons, tools, ornaments, and trade across the ancient world. Wherever civilizations expanded, copper often followed. Yet, despite the scale of production at Khirbat en-Nahas, one mystery has never faded. Who were the people who operated this industrial landscape? And why did they leave behind so few traces of their own identity? The site's modern name, meaning ruins of copper in Arabic, hints at its long association with metallurgy. Archaeological excavations have uncovered furnaces, workshops, defensive walls, industrial installations, storage areas, and astonishing quantities of industrial waste. Some slag deposits rise several meters high, representing centuries of continuous production. This was not a temporary mining camp. It was an organized industrial complex. Maintaining such an operation required careful planning. Ore had to be extracted, transported, crushed, and smelted at carefully controlled temperatures. Charcoal had to be produced in enormous amounts. Water and food had to reach workers despite the harsh desert environment. Skilled craftsmen supervised each stage of production, while administrators likely coordinated labor, storage, and distribution. Nothing about Khirbat en-Nahas suggests a small or isolated community. Instead, it reflects remarkable organization. Radiocarbon dating indicates that major industrial activity flourished during the late 2nd and early 1st millennium BC, although mining in the broader region began much earlier. These dates place the site within a period of profound political and economic change across the southern Levant, when regional kingdoms emerged alongside expanding trade networks connecting Egypt, Arabia, Mesopotamia, and the Mediterranean. Copper was no ordinary commodity. It represented wealth, influence, power. Whoever controlled production at Khirbat en-Nahas possessed access to a resource that neighboring societies urgently needed. Yet, identifying those controllers has proven surprisingly difficult. Some archaeologists associate the site with the ancient kingdom traditionally linked to Edom, whose territory occupied much of southern Jordan during the Iron Age. Excavations reveal increasing social complexity during this period, suggesting centralized authority capable of managing large-scale industrial production. Under this interpretation, Khirbat en-Nahas served as one of the economic foundations supporting an emerging regional kingdom. Others urge greater caution. Political identities during this era remain difficult to reconstruct with certainty. Industrial organization does not automatically require a fully developed kingdom. Powerful tribal confederations, regional elites, or shifting alliances may also have directed mining operations. The archaeology demonstrates organization. It does not always identify those responsible. The scale of production raises further questions. Some estimates suggest that copper smelting continued here over many generations, consuming extraordinary quantities of fuel. Entire landscapes may have been transformed as trees were harvested to produce charcoal for the furnaces. Every ingot represented countless hours of labor performed under intense desert heat. Who were these workers? Were they free craftsmen passing specialized knowledge from one generation to the next? Seasonal laborers recruited from nearby communities, prisoners captured during regional conflicts, or members of hereditary mining families whose skills became essential to the ancient economy. The archaeological evidence remains frustratingly incomplete. Unlike royal capitals filled with inscriptions and monuments, industrial sites rarely preserve detailed historical records. Workers seldom carved their names into stone. Administrators often wrote on materials that failed to survive. Daily life disappeared while furnaces, slag heaps, and stone foundations remained. The industry survived archaeology. The individuals did not. One particularly intriguing aspect of Khirbat en-Nahas is the remarkable sophistication of its metallurgy. Scientific analysis shows that smelting techniques became increasingly efficient over time. Furnace designs improved. Waste products gradually contained less remaining copper, indicating that ancient metallurgists continuously refined their methods. This was not static technology. It evolved. Knowledge accumulated across generations. Someone experimented. Someone taught apprentices. Someone discovered better ways to control heat, airflow, and chemical processes. Yet, the innovators themselves remain anonymous. More speculative interpretations naturally emerge from this silence. Some researchers have wondered whether highly specialized metallurgical knowledge was guarded by elite families or religious authorities, passed down only to carefully selected individuals. Across many ancient societies, metalworking carried an almost mystical reputation. Watching glowing ore transform into shining metal through fire could easily appear miraculous. Perhaps the furnaces themselves possessed ritual significance. Perhaps ceremonies accompanied the beginning of each smelting season. There is little direct evidence confirming such ideas at Khirbat en-Nahas. Yet elsewhere in the ancient world, metallurgy often blended practical skill with symbolic meaning. The desert itself adds another layer to the mystery. Today, the surrounding valleys appear isolated, but thousands of years ago they echoed with human activity. Fires burned continuously. Ore arrived from nearby mines. Animals carried supplies across rocky terrain. Smoke drifted into the sky while molten copper poured from furnaces that glowed through the darkness. Then, gradually, the fires went out. The workshops fell silent. the workers disappeared. Standing today among the immense slag heaps of Khirbat and en-Nahas, it is difficult to imagine the extraordinary effort once concentrated within this harsh landscape. Every black mound represents countless furnace cycles, each requiring skill, endurance, and organization on a remarkable scale. Somewhere beneath the industrial debris may still rest forgotten workshops, living quarters, or overlooked inscriptions capable of revealing who these copper smelters truly were. Until then, the ruins remain a powerful reminder that some of history's greatest achievements were built not by kings whose names filled royal chronicles, but by anonymous craftsmen whose labor shaped civilizations before quietly disappearing into the desert. And if Khirbat and en-Nahas reminds us that entire industries can outlive the people who built them, the next mystery turns our attention to a different kind of silence, one left behind when a magnificent palace was abandoned to fire. Here, wealth did not simply disappear beneath the desert. It collapsed within richly decorated halls, leaving archaeologists to wonder what became of those who should have inherited its legacy. In the fertile hills of the western Galilee, in what is now northern Palestine, the ancient mound of Tel Kabri rises gently above fields and orchards. At first glance, it appears modest, blending almost effortlessly into the surrounding landscape. Yet, beneath its layers of earth lies the memory of one of the most impressive Canaanite palaces of the Middle Bronze Age, a royal residence whose painted walls, ceremonial halls, and extraordinary wine cellars reveal a society of remarkable sophistication. For centuries, Tel Kabri flourished as the center of a prosperous regional kingdom. Its rulers entertained guests within elaborately decorated chambers. Skilled artisans covered walls with colorful frescoes inspired by artistic traditions from across the eastern Mediterranean. Storerooms overflowed with imported goods, luxury ceramics, oils, and vast quantities of wine. Diplomats, merchants, and local elites almost certainly gathered beneath its painted ceilings, discussing alliances, trade, and the uncertain politics of the ancient Levant. Then, unexpectedly, the palace was abandoned. Its halls collapsed. Its story ended. One of the most remarkable discoveries at Tel Kabri came from the excavation of an enormous wine storage complex. Archaeologists uncovered dozens of large storage jars carefully arranged inside a palace room, each once containing wine flavored with herbs, honey, cedar resin, and other ingredients. Chemical analysis revealed traces of sophisticated winemaking unlike anything previously discovered at such a scale in the region. This was not merely a royal household. It was a thriving political center supported by wealth, agriculture, and extensive trade. Yet, shortly afterward, the palace ceased to function. The reason remains uncertain. Excavations reveal signs of sudden structural collapse. Portions of the building appear to have suffered severe damage before being abandoned. Cracked floors, fallen walls, and displaced masonry suggest that a powerful earthquake may have struck the palace during the 17th century BC. Geological studies conducted around the site have strengthened this interpretation, indicating that seismic activity could explain much of the observed destruction. Under this view, nature itself ended the kingdom's prosperity. The earthquake damaged critical sections of the palace. Its rulers departed. The administrative center never fully recovered. Many archaeologists regard this as the most convincing explanation. Yet, the evidence does not answer every question. Some parts of the palace also show traces of burning. Fire affected sections of the complex, although determining precisely when the flames spread, and whether they occurred immediately after the structural collapse or during a later episode, remains difficult. Ancient buildings frequently burned after earthquakes as cooking fires, lamps, or stored materials ignited damaged structures. But fire can also follow conflict. Could both events have occurred? Did an earthquake weaken the palace before opportunistic enemies attacked? Or did political instability begin long before the buildings finally collapsed? The archaeological record leaves room for multiple possibilities. Another mystery concerns the people themselves. Large palaces normally housed administrators, servants, guards, craftsmen, and members of the ruling household. Yet, Tel Kabri has yielded surprisingly little evidence of widespread panic or mass casualties inside the palace. Where did everyone go? If disaster struck suddenly, why are there so few human remains? Some researchers suggest that the inhabitants escaped before the building became completely unstable. Earthquakes often produce warning tremors, allowing at least some people to flee collapsing structures. Others believe the palace may already have been partially abandoned for political or economic reasons before its final destruction. The sequence remains uncertain. The absence of a clear successor deepens the mystery. Tel Kabri had been an important center of regional authority. One might expect another nearby palace to rise immediately and inherit its political role. Instead, the kingdom seems to fade from prominence, leaving only scattered archaeological traces of changing settlement patterns across the surrounding region. Who inherited its territory? Did local elites establish smaller centers elsewhere? Or did neighboring kingdoms quietly absorb the lands once governed from Tel Kabri? Written records remain frustratingly scarce. The silence has encouraged broader speculation. Some researchers wonder whether the palace represented the seat of a ruling dynasty that simply disappeared after catastrophe struck. Without surviving royal inscriptions or administrative archives, reconstructing succession becomes nearly impossible. Entire families may have relocated, merged with neighboring kingdoms, or lost their authority so completely that later generations preserved no memory of their names. Others suggest that environmental pressures beyond the earthquake contributed to the kingdom's decline. Changes in trade, agricultural production, or regional politics may already have weakened Tel Kabri before disaster arrived. Under this interpretation, the earthquake became not the sole cause of collapse, but the final event in a longer period of instability. More speculative theories reach further still. Because of the palace's remarkable frescoes and sophisticated architecture, some have imagined that Tel Kabri preserved unique ceremonial traditions inherited from wider Mediterranean networks that vanished with its ruling elite. Others propose that undiscovered administrative buildings may still lie beneath unexcavated portions of the mound, containing archives capable of explaining the kingdom's final years. At present, such ideas remain possibilities rather than conclusions. The strongest evidence continues to point toward a combination of natural disaster and historical uncertainty. Standing today upon the quiet mound of Tel Kabri, it is difficult to imagine the elegance that once filled these ruined foundations. Painted walls reflected flickering lamplight. Enormous jars of carefully prepared wine lined storerooms awaiting royal banquets. Courtyards echoed with conversation as diplomats and nobles planned futures they believed would endure for generations. Instead, silence arrived. The palace fell. Its successors remain largely unknown. Perhaps somewhere beneath the remaining unexcavated sections of Tel Kabri rests a forgotten archive, an overlooked royal chamber, or another sealed storeroom capable of revealing who attempted to rebuild after disaster struck, or why no one truly did. Until then, the burned palace of Tel Kabri remains one of the Levant's quietest mysteries, reminding us that even the grandest seats of power can vanish so completely that only fractured walls and unanswered questions remain behind. And perhaps that is what makes ancient sacred places so profoundly mysterious. Unlike palaces, they were not built simply to govern. Unlike fortresses, they were not raised merely for defense. Their purpose reached beyond survival into belief itself. When such places are abandoned, they leave behind not only ruined stones, but unanswered questions about the people whose hopes, fears, and rituals once gave them meaning. Few sites capture that quiet mystery more completely than the earliest sanctuary on Mount Ebal. Rising above the rugged central highlands of Palestine, Mount Ebal dominates the surrounding landscape with a stark, imposing presence. Its rocky slopes are covered with scattered limestone, sparse vegetation, and narrow terraces carved by generations of seasonal rains. From its summit, broad valleys unfold in every direction, revealing natural routes that have connected communities since prehistoric times. Even today, the mountain feels isolated from ordinary life. The wind moves almost constantly across its ridges, carrying little more than silence. It is a place that naturally invites contemplation. Long before archaeologists arrived with excavation tools and surveying equipment, countless generations had looked toward this mountain with curiosity. Somewhere upon these slopes stood a sanctuary unlike any ordinary settlement, a carefully constructed ritual complex that appears to have attracted visitors over many years before being quietly abandoned. The mystery does not begin with its discovery. It begins with its purpose. Excavations carried out during the late 20th century uncovered a remarkable archaeological complex dating primarily to the late 2nd millennium BC. Rather than finding houses, workshops, or defensive walls typical of a village, archaeologists revealed an arrangement centered upon a large rectangular stone structure surrounded by paved areas, enclosure walls, layers of ash, stone installations, and carefully deposited animal bones. The layout immediately suggested ceremonial activity. This was not a place where people simply lived. It was somewhere they came to perform something important. The central structure itself became the focus of intense debate. Built from unworked fieldstones and filled internally with layers of earth and smaller rocks, it lacks many of the decorative features commonly associated with monumental temples elsewhere in the ancient Near East. There are no carved reliefs, no surviving statues, and no inscriptions identifying its builders. Its simplicity is striking. Yet, simplicity does not imply insignificance. In many ancient societies, sacred places emphasized ritual rather than ornamentation. What mattered was not appearance alone, but the ceremonies performed within them. Surrounding the structure, archaeologists recovered thousands of animal bones, many belonging to sheep, goats, cattle, and fallow deer. Detailed analysis revealed that the animals were generally young and healthy, precisely the kinds of offerings frequently associated with ritual sacrifice in numerous ancient cultures. Many bones showed evidence of burning. Ash accumulated in distinct layers. Fire had played a central role here. Again and again, the repeated nature of these deposits indicates that the sanctuary remained active over an extended period rather than serving a single ceremonial occasion. People returned repeatedly. Generations may have climbed these slopes, carrying offerings whose meaning has long since vanished. The original excavator, Adam Zertal, proposed that the site represented an early altar connected with traditions later preserved in biblical literature describing Mount Ebal as the location of important covenant ceremonies. His interpretation attracted enormous attention because it appeared to offer archaeological evidence potentially relating to one of the region's most debated historical narratives. If true, the implications would be extraordinary. Yet, archaeology demands caution. Many scholars acknowledge the ritual character of the site while questioning whether it can be confidently connected with specific biblical events. Material evidence can identify construction methods, pottery styles, animal remains, and chronological phases. It cannot identify beliefs with certainty. It cannot reveal the names of priests. It cannot preserve spoken prayers carried away by the wind more than 3,000 years ago. This distinction remains crucial. The sanctuary unquestionably existed. Its precise religious identity remains uncertain, Perhaps the greatest mystery lies within its earliest phase. Beneath later additions and modifications, the first builders created an organized ceremonial complex whose design already reflects established traditions rather than experimental construction. Whoever planned this sanctuary possessed clear ideas about sacred space, movement, and ritual practice. But where did those ideas originate? One possibility suggests that nearby highland communities gradually developed distinctive religious customs adapted to their environment. Small, pastoral settlements often relied upon elevated gathering places where seasonal ceremonies reinforced shared identity and social cooperation. Under this interpretation, Mount Ebal emerged naturally as an important regional sanctuary serving scattered communities throughout the surrounding hills. Another possibility points toward broader cultural connections. Throughout the Late Bronze Age and early Iron Age, the southern Levant experienced profound political and demographic change. Established kingdoms weakened. New settlements appeared across the highlands. Trade networks shifted. Populations moved between regions. Could the builders of Mount Ebal have carried older ritual traditions with them? Perhaps ceremonies performed here preserved customs inherited from communities displaced during the wider transformations affecting the eastern Mediterranean. The archaeological evidence neither confirms nor excludes this possibility. The absence of written records leaves considerable room for interpretation. Interestingly, the sanctuary differs noticeably from many urban temples known elsewhere in the region. There is little evidence of elaborate palatial administration or permanent priestly residences. Instead, the complex appears relatively modest despite its obvious importance. This has led some researchers to imagine that Mount Ebal functioned as a pilgrimage destination rather than a continuously occupied religious center. Visitors may have arrived seasonally, performed ceremonies, presented offerings, then returned to their homes below. If so, the mountain itself became the sacred focus rather than an elaborate temple maintained year-round. The surrounding landscape strengthens this impression. Natural pathways converge toward the mountain from multiple directions. Broad views extend across neighboring valleys, creating an atmosphere well-suited for communal gatherings visible from considerable distances. Even geography seems to participate in the sanctuary's design. Then came the abandonment. Unlike cities overwhelmed by warfare, the sanctuary reveals remarkably little evidence of violent destruction. There are no widespread burn layers suggesting military conquest. Defensive structures are notably absent. Human remains indicating sudden catastrophe have not been found. Instead, ritual activity simply appears to stop. The ash deposits cease. Offerings disappear. The sanctuary falls silent. Why? Mainstream archaeology generally attributes the abandonment to changing patterns of settlement, evolving religious traditions, or shifting political authority during the early Iron Age. Sacred centers often rise and decline as populations reorganize themselves. New ceremonial locations emerge while older ones gradually lose significance. Such changes need not involve violence. Belief itself evolves. Yet, the timing remains intriguing. If Mount Ebal once served as an important gathering place, abandoning it would likely have represented a significant cultural transformation rather than an ordinary local decision. What inspired that change? Did new religious customs replace older ceremonies? Did nearby communities relocate, carrying their traditions elsewhere? Or did broader political developments alter the social networks that had sustained pilgrimage to the mountain? No surviving text explains what happened. The silence has encouraged more speculative theories. Some researchers have suggested that portions of the earliest sanctuary remain concealed beneath later deposits, preserving additional architectural phases capable of clarifying how rituals originally unfolded. Others wonder whether nearby slopes still hide temporary camps where pilgrims once stayed during ceremonial festivals. A few have proposed that sacred objects deliberately buried before abandonment may remain undiscovered beneath untouched sections of the site. These possibilities remain entirely unconfirmed. They reflect the questions archaeology continues to ask rather than established conclusions. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Mount Ebal is not its architecture, but its atmosphere. Standing among the weathered stones today, surrounded by distant ridges and uninterrupted skies, it is easy to imagine processions ascending the mountain in silence. Fires flickered against rough limestone walls. Smoke drifted upward into the evening air. Priests, elders, families, and travelers gathered around ceremonies whose words have been lost forever. Then, almost without explanation, those gatherings ended. The fires grew cold. The pathways emptied. The sanctuary became another forgotten place where stone outlived memory. And perhaps that is the quiet tragedy shared by so many ancient sanctuaries. The stones remain exactly where they were placed, but the people who once understood their meaning are gone. Yet, sometimes, it is not only sacred places that fall into silence. Entire kingdoms can disappear just as quietly, leaving behind scattered inscriptions, ruined fortresses, and a handful of names preserved in foreign records. Among the most elusive of these forgotten realms is the kingdom of Kui, a prosperous state that once controlled one of the eastern Mediterranean's most strategic landscapes before fading almost imperceptibly from history. Stretching across the fertile plains of ancient Cilicia, in what is now southern Turkey, the kingdom of Kui occupied a remarkable crossroads between Anatolia, Syria, and the Mediterranean Sea. Snow-fed rivers descended from the towering Taurus Mountains, watering rich agricultural lands before emptying into broad coastal plains. To the north lay narrow mountain passes that connected central Anatolia with the south. To the east extended caravan routes leading toward Mesopotamia and the Levant. To the west opened the sea, carrying merchants, diplomats, and armies across the Mediterranean. Few kingdoms occupied a more valuable position. Control of Kui meant control of movement, trade, communication, military strategy. For centuries, this landscape supported thriving settlements surrounded by orchards, grain fields, and fortified cities. The kingdom became wealthy through agriculture, commerce, and its ability to serve as a bridge between larger civilizations. Yet, despite its importance, the final chapter of Kui remains strangely obscure. There is no dramatic account of its destruction, no famous last battle, no single catastrophe remembered by later generations. Instead, the kingdom appears to fade gradually from the historical record, almost as though it dissolved without anyone noticing. The earliest references to Kui emerged during the early Iron Age, when a number of independent kingdoms arose across Anatolia following the collapse of the Hittite Empire. As imperial authority fragmented around the 12th century BC, new regional powers adapted to a changing political landscape. Kui became one of these successor kingdoms, inheriting parts of an older world while creating a political identity of its own. Its rulers left inscriptions written in both Luwian hieroglyphs and Phoenician script, reflecting a culturally diverse kingdom positioned between multiple traditions. This alone makes Kui fascinating. It was not isolated, it was connected. Ideas, languages, artistic influences, and commercial goods flowed through its territory from every direction. Among the best-known rulers was King Azatawada, whose monumental bilingual inscription discovered at Karatepe provides one of the most important surviving windows into the kingdom. In it, he describes strengthening fortifications, protecting the land, expanding prosperity, and ruling under the authority of his overlord while emphasizing his own accomplishments. The inscription projects confidence, stability, strength. It presents Quay as a secure and flourishing kingdom, yet history rarely remains still. By the 8th century BC, the expanding Neo-Assyrian Empire increasingly dominated the political landscape of the Near East. One kingdom after another found itself negotiating with Assyrian kings through tribute, military alliances, or reluctant submission. Quay was no exception. Assyrian royal inscriptions mention the kingdom repeatedly, describing campaigns, diplomatic relationships, and tribute paid by its rulers. Unlike archaeological excavations, these texts preserve names and events with remarkable clarity. But they tell the story from only one perspective: the imperial perspective. For Assyria, smaller kingdoms often appeared merely as provinces awaiting incorporation into a growing empire. For the people living within Quay, the experience was undoubtedly more complex. Mainstream historians generally agree that Quay gradually lost its independence through increasing Assyrian influence before eventually becoming absorbed into the imperial administrative system during the late 8th century BC. Rather than suffering sudden annihilation, the kingdom underwent political transformation. Its institutions changed, its rulers disappeared, its territory remained. This interpretation explains much of the available evidence, yet it leaves several important questions unanswered. How did ordinary people experience this transition? Did local elites willingly cooperate with Assyrian administrators? Were traditional ruling families allowed to retain limited authority beneath imperial oversight? Or did resistance occur in forms that simply escaped the surviving written record? The archaeology offers only fragments. Some settlements continued without obvious interruption. Others reveal changing administrative practices. Material culture evolved gradually rather than abruptly. This pattern has encouraged historians to describe Quy's disappearance not as collapse in the dramatic sense, but as political absorption. Still, gradual disappearance can be just as mysterious as sudden destruction. The kingdom's own voice becomes increasingly difficult to hear. Its inscriptions cease. Its rulers vanish from history. The name survives primarily within foreign administrative records. The silence grows. Another mystery concerns the kingdom's capital. Although several important sites have been associated with Quay, including Karatepe and Chinakoi, scholars continue debating the precise locations of different administrative centers during various phases of its history. Perhaps authority shifted between cities over time. Perhaps multiple regional centers governed different portions of the kingdom. Or perhaps the principal royal residence remains buried beneath an unexcavated mound somewhere within the Cilician plain. Without discovering extensive royal archives, certainty remains elusive. The kingdom continues to conceal part of its geography. Archaeology has nevertheless revealed considerable sophistication. Fortified settlements protected strategic routes through the Taurus Mountains. Monumental gateways displayed finely carved reliefs depicting rulers, deities, and mythical creatures. Irrigation supported productive agriculture across fertile plains. Trade connected the kingdom with neighboring cultures throughout Anatolia and the eastern Mediterranean. This was no insignificant frontier state. It possessed wealth, administrative organization, cultural confidence, which makes its quiet disappearance all the more remarkable. Some researchers have suggested that Assyrian incorporation may have been less disruptive than earlier historians imagined. Local officials may have continued governing daily affairs while acknowledging imperial authority above them. Languages, religious practices, and economic systems often persisted beneath changing political structures. If true, perhaps Quay never truly disappeared. Perhaps only its political identity did. Others argue that this interpretation risks overlooking forms of resistance that leave little archaeological evidence. Political transformation often reshapes society gradually, making cultural loss difficult to detect within surviving material remains. Entire generations may have witnessed profound changes that archaeology records only as subtle shifts in pottery styles, administrative seals, or settlement organization. Naturally, broader theories have emerged as well. Some writers speculate that important royal archives were intentionally hidden before Assyrian annexation, buried to prevent sensitive diplomatic records from falling into imperial hands. Others imagine that members of the royal family escaped into neighboring regions, preserving forgotten genealogies beyond the reach of surviving inscriptions. No archaeological evidence currently confirms these possibilities. Yet, neither can they be completely dismissed. Many ancient archives remain undiscovered beneath occupied cities or unexplored tells throughout the Near East. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Kui is how completely it illustrates history's quieter forms of disappearance. Not every kingdom ends beneath burning walls or invading armies. Some fade through administrative change, political compromise, and gradual assimilation until only isolated inscriptions preserve memories of their former independence. Standing today among the weathered reliefs of Khirbat or looking across the fertile Cilician plain, it is easy to imagine caravans crossing the countryside beneath the protection of Kui's rulers. Farmers harvested grain along riverbanks. Messengers traveled mountain roads carrying diplomatic correspondence. Kings issued commands from fortified palaces overlooking prosperous lands they believed would endure for generations. Then the inscriptions stopped. The royal titles disappeared. The kingdom became another province within a larger empire. Perhaps beneath one of Cilicia's countless unexplored mounds still rests the missing archive of Kui's final rulers, preserving letters, treaties, and royal decisions that could explain how an independent kingdom quietly surrendered its place in history. Until such a discovery emerges, the silent collapse of Kui remains one of the ancient Near East's most subtle mysteries, reminding us that civilizations do not always vanish in moments of catastrophe. Sometimes they disappear so gradually that history itself barely notices they are gone.